This episode is about the Rings of Power. Okay, yeah, I know, but it kind of kills two birds with one stone, actually. So yeah, it's more about the difference between the creation of the Rings of Power in the lore compared to the way that Amazon, made the timeline in the Rings of Power show. So you'll be able to also see some ways that the rings actually work, specifically for the elves, and get more details about it as it actually was in the lore. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll be joined by my co host Matt. And with that, let's dive right in. Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle Earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Matt Vandevort and Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy. I want to shout out to Jared Stonefield for drawing the thumbnail to this episode. You can check him out at jstonefieldwrites on Instagram, and also check him out on his website at jaredstonefield.com, where he has his short story Ionian Twilight. He is also querying for his book named The Worlds Are Falling. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the White City Podcast. Today I have back with me one of my co-hosts, Matt Vandevort.
Howdy.
It's good to see you, Matt. And
Likewise.
we're going to be going over the Rings of Power and giving a little bit of a timeline of those, and how they were actually, the order in which they were actually created, kind of compared to what Amazon did in the Rings of Power. So Matt, just want to start us off with I guess, who created the rings and why were
Yeah.
they created?
So basically, the rings were the culmination of Sauron's plan to try and corrupt the elves. Because after the fall of Morgoth, he's kind of bouncing around being like, well, I don't like that there's all this good stuff happening, so I need to try and make it stop. And men are really corruptible, but they're not very strong, so I'm going to try and go after the elves. So he comes up with this plan to uh, infiltrate the elves as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and he basically goes to Celebrimbor, who is Feanor's grandson. Although I don't know if it's explicitly clear through whom. I think it's Curanir or somebody like that. Anyways, he goes to Feanor's grandson and is like, "Hey, look, I know how to make really powerful rings." And so first they so one thing is that it's kind of a throwaway line that Gandalf mentions there are a lot of lesser rings that are just plain gold bands, like the One Ring. And so there's like all these magical rings that are just kind of like scattered around Middle Earth. We don't ever see any of them. We don't really know what they do. Probably turn you invisible or something. I've always wondered if they also lose their power after the One Ring is destroyed, but who knows? Then they make the elves and Sauron make, what would that be, 16 rings of, yeah, 16 rings of power, which eventually become the 9 and the 7. They are not created for men and dwarves. They're created for elves because Celebrimbor wants the elves to be able to preserve the goodness of their realms, and Sauron wants to be able to take the elves under his control. Then, in secret, the elves create, without Sauron's help, but still using his designs, which is important, they create the three, which are three unique rings that are untainted by Sauron and are given to Galadriel. One is given to the High King, Gil-galad, and one is given to Círdan. Then, after that, they all put on their rings. They're all like, we're preserving the elf realms and everything's great. And then Sauron goes off to Mordor and crafts the One Ring, the ruling ring. and all the elves immediately are like, "Oh," and take off the three. And that's actually something that they don't put the three rings back on and start using their power until after the battle last of the last alliance, because they know that as long as Sauron has the ring, he can influence them via their rings. But he can't see their rings, but he can influence them. So Celebrimbor has the rings in Eregion, and then Sauron comes a knocking and basically destroys Eregion, brutally destroys Eregion, takes the 16 rings. Although, according to dwarven legends, Celebrimbor gives the Longbeard's ring to their king directly, not Sauron, but that only the dwarves say that, and of course they would. Um, and so, yeah, like he like strings Celebrimbor up as a banner, Sauron does, and like basically tortures him to death. Then he goes off, and during all this time, like it's after he does all this that the Numenorians show up. They kick Sauron's butt. They take him back to Numenor, and which says a lot about the Numenorians because they beat Sauron while he has the ring, and it's like maybe it was him pulling his punches, but like it also genuinely could have been that the Numenorians were just that strong. And then
Yeah, that's
it's not.
crazy.
Yeah, no, the Numenorians are wild. And then eventually he basically causes the downfall of Numenor. And it's not until like years later, like a couple decades maybe after that, that the Battle of the Last Alliance happens, and Sauron is defeated. Isildur takes the One Ring, gets lost in the river, and at that point, the three Elven lords, who at this point Gil-galad had given his ring to Elrond for safekeeping during the battle. So then Elrond and Círdan and Galadriel have them, and then eventually Gandalf, when he arrives on Middle Earth, Círdan goes, "I like the cut of your jib. Here, have a magical ring." In more words than that. You're way better than the last guy that came through here. So, which honestly, that is part of why Saruman is so jealous of Gandalf. Like, I don't think he ever knows explicitly that Gandalf has one of the rings, but in fact, I'm sure he doesn't know explicitly that Gandalf has one of the rings, but he kind of suspects that Gandalf has one of the rings. So anyway, so that's kind of the timeline of the rings. And yeah, I don't know. I think they're really interesting because of like they're magical artifacts and they do a lot of good. The elven rings won't do it. The elven rings do at least. But they are inherently tied to evil. And I think it says a lot about like magical things in the Lord of the Rings universe is that like a lot of them are like infused with something else, which like be it the will of the creator or some other thing. I could get into the sort of alchemical components of that at a different point if I really wanted to, which would actually tie into Tolkien's sort of Tolkien's Catholicism, because you get into like transubstantiation and the Eucharist and things like that, where you've got like the item and the essence of the item and pouring that into that. But a lot of these items in the Lord of the Rings that are magical kind of have their magic imbued in them by their creator. So like Feanor imbuing the light of the like capturing the light of the trees in the Silmarills, or like putting Sauron putting his malice and will into the ring, and the elves putting their desire to preserve and to create not create, really preserve into their rings, which again, I think that's one of the things where it's really important that they're using Sauron's designs. Like that's honestly that is what the rings do, is they preserve. You see Gollum has an unnaturally extended life, but it's kind of a sickly preservation. Bilbo, same thing. Like too little butter spread out over too much toast. The Ringwraiths, their whole thing is that they are men whose lives have been stretched unnaturally thin, and now they are wraiths. The Elven Rings preserve in a less sickly way, or maybe just less sickly because the elves are already immortal. But like the whole reason the elven realms are still these like magical good bastions of the first age is because Elrond and Círdan and Galadriel have these rings that they're using to preserve their realms. Although maybe Círdan's just that cool because he's like the oldest elf ever and he doesn't have a ring after Gandalf shows up. So you have these so like that's basically what the rings do is they preserve and they allow you to like with the one ring it basically shows you what you want but then it twists you after it gives you what you want to do the will of the ring and of Sauron unless you're Gandalf, but we talked about that last time.
Yeah. Yeah, good breakdown there. So I think what's interesting to think about with that are the different the smaller rings. And
Yeah.
as you're saying, like there's not really much that you go off of besides what Gandalf says there to Frodo, but it actually is something that comes up in the show, which is kind of neat.
Oh really?
Um, yeah,
I haven't seen that part yet,
but
but if
yeah,
you want to elucidate me on it, that's fine. Did they have other did like I okay, so
no, it does. Yeah,
I'm gonna guess that
okay,
what happens is because in the show they make the they make the three rings first. And then I've seen shots of Sauron as Anatar showing up. And so I'm assuming that basically what they do is they make the other rings after that. And I'm guessing again, I have not seen the show. I really need to watch the show. I'm guessing that like he shows up and he's like, "Oh no, they made rings. Now I need to have my grubby little hands on them." And so in the show do they make like the lesser rings like the trinkets and stuff and then make the rings of power or do they okay so they actually
yep,
have like what Gandalf calls essays in the craft that's interesting that's interesting yeah like I don't know I do wish Tolkien had written more about the lesser rings because it's just really interesting the only other ring that he really writes about is the ring of Barahir which is just an heirloom. It's a very ancient heirloom and it shows up all over the place. But like Aragorn has it and it goes all the way back to the Silmarillion and it's really cool.
right.
But it's not really magical. It's sort of it has power in that like people recognize it as like, oh, that's the Ring of Bear here. You're an important person, but that's about it. But yeah, like there aren't really he doesn't really say anything else about the other rings other than like I don't know because I'm assuming that some of them can turn you invisible because if that was a property of the One Ring only, Gandalf would have immediately, when Bilbo talks, he discovers that Bilbo has a ring that turns him invisible. He would have immediately known what was up. But
Yeah, but he
they have,
also wasn't sure,
yeah,
like if it
like
was like how powerful it was, if it might have been just a random ring.
yeah. So like that's the thing that I'm wondering about is like, is it like they must be rare enough that it raises some eyebrows but also not so rare that it doesn't immediately give away that oh this is the one ring yeah I mean all of this is just pure conjecture but it's really interesting yeah I don't know I think kind of circling rings circling back to kind of the idea of like what gives the rings power is that so there is a book that Tolkien well it's letters that Tolkien wrote that's called Morgoth's Ring and it basically means like in the same way that Sauron cannot truly be defeated until the ring is destroyed. Morgoth cannot be truly defeated until Arda itself is destroyed. And so the idea is that like and then you look at the music of the Ainur where like Melkor Morgoth is putting his will and his essence into the world. And I think by drawing this comparison between the ring and the world, for Sauron and Morgoth, respectively, Tolkien's kind of giving us a little bit of an insight into how the ring is created and how the rings are created and how like why the rings are so tied to the One Ring and so tied to Sauron is that he put his essence into the very design of and specs of the rings of power. And so even though, like even though the world is good, it's still marred by Morgoth. And even though the elven rings are good, they're still marred by Sauron. And so yeah, you have the rings of power really interesting, which does lead to the question, when the One Ring is destroyed, are the like trinket rings, do they lose their powers? Which now I want to write a short story about like some thief off in Harad who's like sneaking into a house right as the ring is destroyed and then gets caught because he's not invisible anymore. Anyways,
That's funny.
I'll put that idea out there for anyone that wants to write fanfiction.
Yeah. So for like so for the elven rings,
Yeah,
they're specifically called what? Fire, water,
there's a
and
fire one, a water one, and an air one. I can never remember the last one. It's I'm just gonna pull it up. It's Narya is I believe Gandalf's. All right, let's just look. 3 elven ring names. Narya, Nenya, and Vilya. So it's this is just from the Lord of the Rings one wiki.
yeah,
Uh, it's the Ring of Fire, Narya. That's the one that Gandalf has. It's the Nenya, the Ring of Adamant, and Vilya, the Ring of Air. And so, oh, okay. So according to the wiki, at least, Gilgalad had both Arya and Vilya, and then Nenya was always Galadriel's. And so, yeah, there's the Ring of Fire, the Ring of Adamant, and the Ring of Water. And I can't remember. So Nenya was Galadriel's, which is the Ring of Adamant, which makes sense because that's the one that's the most involved in like protection and kind of the bones of the earth sort of ideas. The Ring of Fire makes sense for Gandalf because he's like he 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 lights a lot of things on fire, and he does a lot of things with fire. And then I think if we're gonna go with like the rings are like tied to their elements the most sort of thing, which I don't really think is Tolkien's goal here, but like it works thematically, is that Elrond like controls the river near Rivendell. Most famously in the scene where he uses it to wreck a bunch of ring wraiths, and also like uses it as like a boundary.
What's interesting is that like Gandalf doesn't have a realm or an area that he's like protecting or that he's at like Elrond
What
and
do you mean the
Galadriel.
Shire? Just kidding.
Yeah, of course. Um,
So all right, I'm just gonna look this guy up real fast. Because there's this Tolkien YouTuber who I believe it was him who yeah, I believe it was him who put forth he was talking about the rings, and I don't know if he was pulling this from something that he read or if this is entirely his idea, but I'm going to maybe it's Tolkien Untangled? That is? Yeah, Tolkien Untangled. That's the guy I'm talking about. His videos are really good. He has he talks about the rings, and he talks about the Ring of Fire and the Ring of Water specifically. I think he also talks about Galadriel's, but I really like the idea that the fire that's associated the most with the Ring of Fire is like the fire in men's hearts and like inspiring people to do things. And so, and again, that's like we were talking about before in the last episode, that is like Gandalf's whole deal before he becomes Gandalf the White is I'm going to go around, I'm going to inspire people to do things, I'm going to light a fire under them, I'm going to light a fire in their hearts, and they're going to get stuff done. And then with the ring of water, there's like water is kind of associated with like healing. And so one of the big things about Gandalf is like he has the last homely, or not Gandalf, Elrond. He has the last homely house. He has the last refuge. Like multiple times, people wake up in, maybe not multiple times, but a few times people wake up in Rivendell, like rested and recuperated and healed. You have Elrond, like the biggest example of this is Elrond healing Frodo after he's stabbed by a Morgul blade. And it's like the only person in Middle Earth that could have healed you is Elrond. And so the
With
Ring
or
of
without the
Water
ring?
with the ring.
With the ring.
Yeah, the only reason that, like, the theory goes that the only reason that Elrond was able to heal to counteract the magic of the Morgul blade was because he had specifically Vilya, the Ring of Water. And then Nenya, like, again, I think Galadriel is kind of the most associated with like that preservation of like it's not just, oh, I'm preserving my realm. It's like you like when you read the description of the Fellowship entering Lothlorien, it's like they're stepping into an elven realm from the Silmarillion, or not so like well, even to some extent in the Undying Lands, but like it's like they're stepping into Menegroth, or not so much Nargothrond or Gondolin, but like places like that are like these ancient elven cities, and like time seems to like stand still almost. And when you think of adamant, it's like it's metal. It's like we think, I think at least of like adamantium, which in Marvel is like the strongest, like surest metal. Um, and so you have Galadriel being here, like preserving and keeping things the way they are, and things are not changing, and it's like this strong defense, almost stasis, like almost an unhealthy stasis, which is kind of like the downfall of the elves. Is like they don't want things to change, even though they know that they have to. So I think those like I like the theory that they're not just fancy names for these rings. Like these three rings specifically have specific powers as compared to the other rings that are just kind of like enhancing your own natural abilities, but like also corrupting you into being basically a worse version of yourself. Um, and of course, like the One Ring does have specific abilities of temptation and corruption and you know kind of invisibility and things like that. But yeah, I think the three rings are really interesting because when you talk about like they were not crafted with any input from Sauron, Sauron's kind of like straightforward with what he wants in the ring. It's very manipulative. It's very get into your head. It's very like Sauron is very much about those like mind games and things like that. So that's the kind of power that he would have put into the rings, is the power to like manipulate and trick people. Whereas with the elves, they're crafting them for a different reason, and it's still there because Sauron, like the negatives are still there because it's still tied to the One Ring, but the Elven rings themselves, like, because the other thing you have to remember is like when they're doing it, they're practicing with Sauron's help, and then their goal was to craft the three rings. They didn't really care as much about the other rings. They didn't want anyone else to have them because they kind of knew it would be a bad idea. But like the three rings to them were basically what the One Ring was to Sauron, where it's like this is why I'm making these rings. So yeah, I think the three rings are really interesting.
Yeah.
And one more side thing is that it's fascinating that there's these three specific rings that are forged by Celebrimbor specifically, much like his grandfather forged the three Silmarills, which are like the the artifacts of Middle Earth.
Right.
And also, interestingly enough, and with sorry, I was thinking about Vilya being the ring of water. It's the ring of air. I am that's yeah, that's not true. I got it mixed up. It's not water, it's air. So the 3 Silmarills end up in 3 different elements. So you've got one which is Elbereth, the star. It's the one that is actually the light of that star is what's in the file that Frodo gets from Galadriel. There's one in the sea, and there's one in a fiery chasm, because that's just where they end up. And they're so the 3 Silmarills sort of in a way uh,
Okay. Yeah,
parallel the 3 rings.
that's cool to know. So what's
Yeah.
interesting is that you're saying like the 7 and the 9 weren't specifically created for a purpose of giving them to dwarves and men. It's just like who they ended up giving them to, because they were making them for elves, you're saying.
Yeah, so my understanding of the rings is that of the 16 is that Sauron and Celebrimbor and other elves craft them. Celebrimbor has all of them, and he's kind of thinking, okay, maybe I'll give these out to some elves. Maybe like again, there's a dwarven legend that he gives one directly to probably a Doran, but then he like locks them away once he guesses like, oh, Sauron is a bad guy and he's coming to take the rings, because he discovers like, oh, Sauron made another one, and it's that is now I get why we're doing this. So he locks them away and basically tries to keep them from Sauron. Sauron destroys Eregion, tortures Celebrimbor, turns him into his banner basically. Then Sauron takes the 16 rings and gives them to probably, if I had to guess, he gives them to the 7 lords of the dwarves, and then he's just like, well, I've got 9 left. Let me go find 9 humans that I can, turn to my bidding. And so, yeah, so Sauron is the one that divvies them up. And so, like, I don't think, like, my sort of understanding is that it's not, oh, we crafted the 9 and then the 7 and then the 3 and then the 1. Like in the Ring poem, it's like, oh, we crafted the 16 and then the elves went off and crafted the 3 and Sauron went off and crafted the 1 and then took the 16 and used them to make dwarves greedy and men ghosts.
Yeah. Well, that's good breakdown there of the Order of the Rings and their creation. Also, some of the way that the Elven rings work specifically there. And thanks for tuning in, guys. And I hope you'll catch us for our next episode on some characters and other material on Middle Earth. Thanks for visiting the White City. Before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. We're on YouTube or Facebook under the tag @The White City Podcast.